Peter, first of all, I want to say thank you for hosting us here at WestRock's headquarters here in Atlanta. And also I want to welcome you to AIM 10X Digital 2024. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
No, thanks for that, Brent. Happy to take part. And I mean, it's a wonderful location we have here, and hopefully you're getting to see some of the great things that we actually have as products and some of the customers we have too.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that, we thought we'd just kick it off with having you give a bit of an introduction in terms of your roles, your remit within WestRock, and also for the audience that may be less familiar, a brief overview of what WestRock does as an organization.
No, I'd love to do that. It's amazing. I was just thinking back after I was invited to do this, 37 years in supply chain now. And looking back, I think it seems like it was yesterday when I started. So I got the pleasure to work 20 years in consulting, prior to that obviously in industry. But the last 7 years, I had the opportunity to be Chief Supply Chain Officer, and last 2.5 years here at WestRock. And it's just amazing in terms of how complex our supply chain is, some of the great things that we're doing. And WestRock is really on a journey. I mean, it's for those of you who don't know much about WestRock, it really is a fiber-based packaging company. And everything we do in supply chain and across the company is all about circularity. And that really drives everything. And just to give you a scale and scope of it, starts with our recycle plants where we recycle materials, bring those in. We have 18 of those across the US. We're a global company, but recycling is just in the US. We have mills that then convert both virgin fiber and recycled fiber into paperboard and containerboard. So for corrugated boxes and other things that are in the consumer industry. That then goes out into our corrugated and converting plants that we have about 240 of, and then it's distributed through about 300 plus warehouses. Then the journey begins again, and we collect it and bring it through the recycling network, and this true circular loop. So very much environmentally focused, very much thinking about sustainability and how we can help all of our customers with that.
I appreciate that, Peter. I think when we talk about just the sheer amount of complexity that WestRock has, it's a good segue into the next question.
Well, and one of the pieces I didn't even talk about was actually thinking about our machinery division. That would actually, we supply the machinery to some of the customers as well. So it's a fully closed loop supply chain that we have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when we talk about just supply chain and the elevation of supply chain, both as a competitive differentiator over the past several years, but also the need to perform through ever ongoing demand and supply volatility. Would love to hear your perspective in terms of how have those topics rose in importance, both within executive level meetings and board level meetings? And could you give us a sense of what does the shift look like for you over the past several years?
Guys, where to start? I look back and I think about the first probably 30 years of my career. It's what I like to call a rinse and repeat. It was where we were asked to cut costs, or we were asked to create service levels, and we did that over and over. And I think it was 2017 when we started first seeing the big changes and supply chain seeing a different elevation in both leadership teams and in the boardroom. And I think the boardroom piece is really important. That's when we started with the tariffs. I'm sure many of the people who we're talking to actually changed their supply chains dramatically with the tariffs and China and some of the challenges we had back in 17. And then I look forward, like sort of USMCA came along, and for us that companies that have to manage USMCA, that was another challenge. And then lo and behold, that black swan event, COVID. And I say black swan, not black swan as such, but for supply chain professionals, boy, did it make our lives interesting. And I think over that period of time, from 2017 to 22, 23, it really changed the chief supply chain officers and any supply chain exec's role from being just a participant in the leadership team and a participant in the boardroom to actually being the protagonist, to actually having a voice, to being able to change operating models. And really, it's in our hands to continue that as we go through. It's interesting, all of those changes have actually allowed us a real seat at the table and have changed the influence supply chain has. The conversations we have now, in many instances, start with supply chain rather than asking, can supply chain do this at the end? And actually having that integrated conversation with leadership really has elevated that supply chain role. But it's also created a challenge, and it's a challenge for me, it's a challenge for everybody else around, we've had to up our game and step up to a different place and accept that position and actually be able to have a much broader business conversation than just talk about how are we going to manage some logistics costs or what are we going to do with planning this year. It's become a much more holistic discussion around supply chain and how that contributes to the business as a whole. I've spoke to boards more often in the last 3 or 4 years than I probably did in the previous 20. It's not that I'm doing a different role, it's just that with the risk of supply chain today, how people are thinking about changes in supply chain. I mean, one of the things I think has really changed it is there's an acceptance that there's much more agility needed these days. That's meaning we've got to think about capital and assets differently. It means that we actually have to have a larger voice to be able to influence that going forward.
No, I appreciate that. And I think going into the complexity and also the need to elevate supply chain and operations from a capability perspective, I know you all back in 2022 had an Investor Day presentation, and the opportunity that you discussed was over $1 billion of value creation opportunities, of which over half of that sat within supply chain. And would love to hear from your vantage point, what were some of the big drivers that you saw as you joined the organization, and also just some of the learnings that you've had on that journey?
That 2022, May 22, I'll never forget the day, to be honest, was really the start and the commitment from the whole of the leadership team for WestRock in terms of how we think differently. And it was focused on one premise. I mean, we talk about the savings opportunity, but it was about how do we deliver a better service to our customers? How do we really drive customer centricity? And then obviously if you drive customer centricity, you grow, you can look at things in a very different way with customers. So that has like sort of a separate effect that it drove 500 million in terms of savings. But what it also did was drive a whole host of other things around sustainability, around diversity of suppliers, around how we actually work with our customers and share information, which are over and above the intangibles really that are over and above the 500 million. So it started out as looking at it purely as a supply chain transformation and saying, good old-fashioned words, what are we going to do around people, process, and technology? How are we going to drive value across the business? Again, value for all of the people who work in the organization, our teammates, to make it a better place for them to work, to be a better place for us to attract talent and retain talent. And again, back to the customer piece. So we started saying, what foundational elements do we need to have for that? What are the expectations of our team, our suppliers, and our customers? And so we broke it down in typical areas: purchasing, planning, logistics, quality, safety, operational excellence, and said, we don't necessarily want to be world-class in every one of these, but what would truly make a difference to us if we were able to do it? And what's the value that we can drive by actually doing these different things together? So for instance, in purchasing, we looked across both indirect and direct materials. We brought some new tools in. We went on an ERP journey around SAP and S4. So some of the tools that we have allow us to do much more with spend cubes and RFQs and the ability to do things more efficiently, as well as looking at how we consolidate spend and do things in a different way. We then looked at logistics and said, we actually have a huge logistics spend. I mean, it's over 2 billion. So logistics is a huge area for us. I mean, most people don't realize, but any point in time, I have about 10,000 trailers on the road. We're number 1 or number 2 boxcar user in the US. number 17 in terms of export from the US. So it's a massive logistics organization. So having the right tools to actually run that, and more importantly, the visibility. Because as supply chain professionals, how long have we been talking about, if you just give me visibility, I can fix everything? Well, we went down the route and we have a visibility tool as well now. So that was logistics and how we built that out. And then we looked at quality and said, how do we build out the quality tools that can actually just not do compliance and assurance, but actually drive us through customer quality, manufacturing quality, and supplier quality. And that's really changed the paradigm in terms of how we think about that across the organization. And then I guess the bit you really want to dive into is the planning element. We have a super complex planning environment. It's been developed over many years, and on the basis of looking at that with the tools that we had available and how we wanted to really build out an integrated end-to-end supply chain of the future, we then selected O9 and started on the journey of working through all of the good planning elements of demand planning, supply planning, looking at those to start with, thinking about how we take demand planning to the next level with tools such as multi-corollaries and getting to much more creative ways of doing demand planning. And then thinking about how do we do MEIO? I mean, we have a multi-tiered system in that we need to plan right the way from raw materials, from the trees that are growing out in the forests, the recycled materials that are coming back from our customers, all of that right the way through the mills to what types of paper we're making, down to widths, weights, colors, grades, everything. That then gets shipped out to those 240 sites, and we've got to balance the inventory at each of those, and right the way through to finished goods inventory and the balancing of all of that. So looking at that as single buckets previously was complex, but now taking the problem as a whole makes it multidimensional, and that's one of the reasons why we needed to go to a planning tool to do that. Many benefits identified across all of those areas. I mean, all of those contribute towards the 500 million. The first year, we delivered nearly 300 million benefits from the supply chain initiative. So we're proving out what we set out to do. We're doing a huge amount at the same time. And I've got to recognize our leadership team, the CEO, CFO, and all of the business unit presidents for actually having the faith and undertaking such a complex change all at the same time. And that's what's really unusual about this. Normally you do lots of these things at different times. We've done it all together, and actually we're reaping the benefits from that. And that's what's really exciting, not just for me, but for my team as well.
No, that's great. I appreciate you going through that very comprehensive answer. I think it's an amazing point to step back and also recognize all the results that have been delivered so far, but also the opportunity that lies ahead as well. And I think that's a good segue into the next question. When you talk about the opportunity areas, whether it's from procurement to planning to manufacturing to quality, there's an immense value opportunity, but also there's a level of investment, both from people, technology, time, et cetera. How did you think about the prioritization of those initiatives, and what are some of the learnings that you would share with the audience today?
So as you'd expect it, I mean, it was something that evolved over time. One of the very first things we sat down and said, what is our end state vision? What do we believe we need to have to deliver not only the benefits, but make it sustainable for the future? And so it was multi-pronged in terms of how do we think about the technology elements from that? What tools do we need to make that sustainable? And how does that fit into the overall program that we were starting with ERP and SAP and what we call Mac 1, which is our overarching systems transformation that bundles a whole host of different things together. So it started with that technology piece and what did we need? And then we started looking at people and saying, what does that mean from an organization construct? What does it mean from how we think about training, what skills we have, who do we need to hire, where do we need to upskill, what do we need to do differently? So that played into the prioritization as well. And then the big part of it was around, well, what processes can we change? What makes sense to change now, maybe in advance of some of the ERP changes, versus what can we do for some learnings. So, I mean, one of the real cool things that we actually started with was saying, where can we get benefits? Again, back to where can we improve OTIF, for instance, without necessarily having all of the technology in place to do it. So what we started looking at was, how do we train some individuals differently? How do we create a new process? But what that's done is basically created user cases for how we think the technology should be configured. So it's almost like, sort of, instead of going along and designing a process and then testing it and saying, I'm not sure that I really like that, I would have maybe done it a different way, we've actually been able to trial and test some of these processes before we've actually rolled them and coded them into the systems, which has been fantastic, because what we've been able to show is the value of doing it with people and process rather than just technology. But then the technology is going to make it sustainable. So going through all of that and looking at that in that focused way allowed us to say, how do we prioritize? Because there's some things we couldn't do until we actually had technology in place. How do we prioritize these other pieces? But it started off with the end state vision of, what do we need to have as a technology end state to allow us to be successful and sustainable in the future?
Very clear. And I think it's really important to cast that vision of where you want to be from an end state perspective, and making sure that everybody's aligned to that vision. Yeah. So amazing.
Well, it's a great story to tell everybody as well. I mean, if you think about the story you can tell to your teams, you can tell to the organization, more importantly, you can talk to suppliers and customers about, it really generates enthusiasm and energy, and people can see the value as you're actually driving through the process. So it's got multifaceted benefits.
Great. So if we were to also talk about what is the ultimate success on a number of these technology initiatives, a lot of it sits on the ability to leverage the data within your ecosystem and also outside your ecosystem. So WestRock has access and the ability to generate immense amounts of data, but there's also so much expertise that lies within the planning community, the operations, et cetera. Can you give a little bit of a sense of how you envision and how you see technology both helping to institutionalize some of that tribal knowledge, and also understanding where the data needs to be collected, harmonized, and how do you bring that to allow people to do their best work each and every day?
I think you probably, starting with something that I laugh with my team about, it's my pet topic, because having been in consulting for many years and going through many different projects and having many different challenges with data, that's where we always start the discussions. That was part of the prioritization as well, as to what data can we get to and how clean is it? What do we have to do differently? So the data piece really is the foundation, and that's where we started with a lot of the things that we were doing. How do we break down purchasing contracts to be able to get data on logistics? How are we looking at things in logistics to be able to pull data, to be able to compare like for like, rather than apples and oranges? And so data is the absolute key to all of that. And you make a really interesting point around, it's not just about the data that's encapsulated in systems. So, I mean, we have a planning system prior to '09 that has over 1 million parameters in it. Every one of those has been put into the system at some point in the past. Does that capture at the essence of what the system needs to do? Absolutely not, because that only gives you a 70% answer. The key is starting to think about how you capture the information that is inherent with the senior planners, the people who really understand the business. And we're started to do some really cool things actually out in some of the manufacturing plants, where because of talent challenges, how do you train somebody on to operate a large machine? I mean, historically in the past, it was by being on the machine, learning with somebody else and spending time going through multiple roles and getting to that position. And you learned as well as that person who taught you knew. You didn't really add to it until maybe you'd been there for a few years and you'd learned some ways to do some things differently and better. Where we're at the moment is starting to think about how we use AI and Gen AI to actually start to capture manuals for training, all those little hints and tips, center lining capabilities, reliability tools and everything, and putting that into a model and saying, well, when this goes wrong, maybe this is the things you should try. And what we're doing is capturing all that inherent knowledge from the operators in that. And we're looking about how we can do that across many different areas. So planning will be one of those areas that we start thinking more about that, because as you know, you've probably heard 1,000 times, the biggest challenge you have with planners is getting them to believe the answer that came out the black box, because nobody understands the black box. Well, I think some of the new tools will allow us to actually get to the point where people can understand some of what's coming out, so it's believable, so people don't try and change what the answer is.
Yeah, and we see this even within our own technology ecosystem in terms of the ability to leverage AI and generative AI concepts through LLMs and others to really help, mostly centered around early on digital assistance of how can you take that tribal knowledge and how can you elevate and expose some of those answers in a way that is very emblematic of what you see today in some of the LLMs. But we also see opportunities around how do you do more advanced education? How do you improve the implementation? How do you ensure that there's always the continuous improvement? So I think the opportunity areas for those technologies, especially within the AI ecosystem, is immense there.
I agree completely. I think that the key is taking it from that digital assistant to visualization. And the visualization is the piece that actually, I think, joins the dots for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I think moving into the next question around a bit of the technology capabilities, I'd be keen to understand from your vantage point, as you look at all of the emerging technologies that are moving at a very, very rapid pace, how does WestRock think about technology partnerships? And also, what do you expect from your technology partners to bring in these discussions to make sure WestRock is at the leading edge of both technology and operational efficiency?
I think we're so fortunate here in that we have a great construct in terms of how we think about new technologies and development. And it's not just with customers, it's not just with suppliers, but within our own team as well. We have a CIO and a number of us, myself, business unit presidents, that actually are part of an AI council and an automation and digital enablement group. And what we do as a leadership team is actually go out and look and hunt for some of the great things that are actually happening out there at the moment. Things that are really happening, not things that people are talking about, but things we can look and see and touch. And so we've developed relationships with some of the leading brands around AI. We've done some really cool things with sensor technologies, and we've been working with a number of different partners around those things. And it really has been a broad spectrum. I mean, everything from the largest companies out there right the way down to startups, because we actually work with some startups as well in terms of how we bring this technology together. And our CIO is also our Chief Digital Officer, has got this great vision of how we put all these different pieces together. And it links everything across, not just our, as I say, our internal network, external as well, about how we think about tracking packages, how we think about what we're doing around added value of our boxes and what services can we offer to our customers around that. So we have to be at the forefront of it because it's part of our technology that we're actually offering as our product set in the future for our customers. So it's really, really important for us. And we spend, as a leadership group, probably 3 or 4 hours a month actually just focusing on technologies and going and looking and seeing some of the new things that are out there, and then figuring out how we can do things quickly with it. We talk about do something fast, fail fast. We truly epitomize that in terms of how we've approached some of these things.
That's great. I really appreciate that answer because I think it helps just to talk about how do you properly put the ever-evolving technology landscape into the proper framework in terms of how you guys are prioritizing that. And I think as we move into maybe my final question here is, I know you are very passionate about supply chain talent and how do you develop the next set of leaders. And also, with some of the topics we've talked about earlier today, the ever emerging role of supply chain as a critical competitive differentiator, but also the need to be able to upskill your team and to be able to make sure that they're embracing digital with operational excellence. Can you give some thoughts both from how does a supply chain leader think about developing talent, and also even for some of the emerging supply chain leaders, any practical advice you'd say in terms of how do you continue to keep that learning mindset as you move forward in your career?
One of the things that in every role I've had, I think it'd be fair to say that talent is always number one or number two, and it will never change. I've learned some of the most important lessons in my career as a supply chain person, sometimes from people who you would never have expected. Some of the things that actually people are looking at and researching that are just coming out as undergrads today, every one of us can learn something from them. Figuring out how you can actually have that intellectual curiosity, how you can enable people across the organization to feel like they can contribute and come up with sometimes crazy ideas. But some of those crazy ideas actually will be things that we have in the future. And so creating that environment where everybody feels they can contribute is really important. I mean, we've done a number of things like hackathons and that within our team and within the organization in terms of how do we improve stuff. But back to the whole talent piece. It's not just about building my successor. It's not about building the leadership team that sit within my group. It really is right the way from the day the person walks through into our organization and how we then keep and retain them. And it really is about, how we tell stories about what the future looks like. It's about creating that vision that people can look at and say, we want to be part of that. But to do that, you also have to invest hugely in actually going out and engaging with people. We have a great story. We're a sustainable company. We live and breathe circularity. Now, that's a much better story to tell somebody than we have a number of manufacturing plants and we make boxes. I don't talk about boxes. I talk about our circularity story because that's what WestRock is founded on. It's about making the environment better. And so taking the right message, working very much with colleges and universities, and actually getting them to change how they're teaching undergrads and grads to bring the right skills into the organization. But it's great bringing them in with the right skills, but if the next tier up doesn't listen to them because they don't hear something because they're speaking a different language, it's about how we create that common language as well across the organization so that everybody can say, great example, AI. Everybody loves AI, don't they? It's the word of the moment.
It is the word of the moment, yes.
1957. I think was the date that it was actually founded and created. Yeah. Then you think about, within AI, there's then ML, and then there's Gen AI. We really need as supply chain professionals in our organizations and across the groups to have a common vocabulary and a common understanding so that when somebody says something, you don't have to go to Google it and look up as to what they're talking about. And I have a different vocabulary probably to you, probably to somebody who has just come out from college. So transcending that and getting all of that together is really key. And that helps from a retention perspective. It also then starts to help with upskilling because we start talking about capabilities and skills that we need to have, which then allow us to actually focus on training. And that's the next layer in this, in that I think many organizations don't spend enough time on recognizing what do we need to do differently and then figuring out what are the skills and capabilities we need to deliver in our teams to allow the teams to be super successful. And that also motivates the individuals as well. And making it so it's not just, I got the certificate, but boy, did I learn something really different. I need to tell everybody else about this. And that enthusiasm actually becomes infectious. And that's what makes talent really important as we move forward over the next years. Skills and supply chain are going to change dramatically from even 5 years ago to what we're going to need in the future. Having adaptability, having the ability to think about data in different ways, thinking about things more from a data science type of perspective, thinking about how do I figure something out in advance rather than fixing it in the rearview mirror. That's what we need to think differently about, and that's a very different talent for the future.
Got it. Well, Peter, thank you so much for going through that. I think it's amazing when you look at WestRock, the investments that are being made from a technology perspective, the leadership buy-in that you've had in terms of how do you develop the next set of leaders, and also, to your point, some aspects of storytelling and understanding how do you continue to provide the professional growth opportunities for practitioners to advance in their career, I think is just an amazing trajectory that you guys have built here. So thank you for every bit of insight that you've given us during this session. And again, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Brent. It's been great chatting.
Great.
Thanks.